So, welcome back virtually, George Saunders. We're excited to chat with you a little bit about the new book. Um, and how have you been doing over the last year? I'm curious what life's been like for you in quarantine.
Well, we were in California and then in quarantine, and then the fires got too close. So we picked up and came to New York, and we've been here since August. And it's been, I mean, quiet. Been working a lot and just kind of, I guess, like everybody, trying to keep my spirits up a little bit and not let the greater sorrow bring me down. But yeah, how about you? How are you holding up?
It's been good overall. I think, leaning into the work has been good. Trying to figure out, especially early on in the pandemic, trying to understand like how to navigate this weird world was kind of strangely invigorating. It's hard to say it that way, but it
Yeah.
was trying to solve that problem. But now that we've kind of gotten into a groove, I think we've found a space to exist in, at least in this current situation.
Yeah, in some weird way, it strikes me as being a little bit like being really sick. Like your things happen, and your normal life is not available to you, and so I mean, one effect is I'm so nostalgic for those like the last time I was in Tulsa and we were in a crowd, that. Um, but it does give you a little bit of second to kind of go, okay, so I really want to get back to the normal stuff, but why? Like, what of that normal stuff is habitual, and what of it is actually worth going back to? So there was some fun in that for the first 4 months, and now I don't know. Now I think I'm ready to go.
We're going to talk in a minute about the new book, and so much of the new book is not just about writing, of course, it's about the act of reading. And I found it really difficult to read at the beginning of this pandemic and try to keep my normal groove. Did you have any kind of issues with keeping your reading life the way it was before?
Well, my reading life for the 2 years I was writing this book was just those 7 stories, pretty much. I would do a little bit of light reading at night and usually fall right to sleep. But during the day, I was just obsessively rereading those Russian stories. And there was definitely a moment there where, with the political situation and the racist murders and the pandemic, where I thought, why am I writing about these hundreds of years old stories? But as you said earlier, the work that I found that really sanity making to just say, okay, I can't control anything going on out there, but I can take this page that I'm working on and make it marginally better. So in some ways, it was kind of an attempt to just get consumed by that small task of writing this book. And then I guess the upshot is, I had the same effect I had on the world as usual, which is nothing. But at least when I came out of a writing session, I felt like myself. I felt kind of powerful and hopeful. And, like if I did need to do something, at least I was all the way there for it, something like that.
Yeah. So, a swim in a pond in the rain. It's four Russian writers. It's 7 stories. First question is, you know, um, I know that this is based on a class you've been teaching for a long time at Syracuse. You've been at Syracuse for quite some time. Um, this, in some ways, is very much like if we had the opportunity to take that class, which is quite selective. I think you have a handful of students each year. This is kind of us getting a chance to step into that space. But how did you kind of land on the 7 stories and the four writers?
Right, because in the real class, we'd be together for a whole semester, and then we'd cover probably 40 different stories and maybe 10 writers or so, So what I really did was I just kind of scanned over my notes. I keep sort of an accreting notebook over the years, and just real quick, just ask myself, what were the best classes every semester? What were the stories that every semester would get the room kind of lit up? And I came up with which is another way of saying which ones can you teach the best, which ones you feel most confident in teaching. And I came up with a list of maybe 12. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted the stories to be in the book because otherwise it's not the same experience. In the Syracuse class, I send a group off to read 1 to 3 stories. They spend all week on them. They come in all charged up to talk about them, and we launch in. So the recent reading is a real feature of the class. So once you say you're going to put the full text in, you can't have a 900-page book. So at least not of this kind. So I came up with the idea that it was going to be 7 to 8, And then it was interesting because I thought, well, I should just put in the seven best stories. But that wasn't quite right. And I thought, no, you're going to put in the seven most teachable stories. And that was these seven. And then there was a whole other sort of Rubik's Cube phase, like, well, which order do I put them in so as not to repeat myself? And my hope was to make a kind of meta narrative in my essays that built to something, which would depend, of course, on the order in which I discussed the stories.
Did the book only work with Russian writers? Meaning, could you have done a version of this same book with all American writers or all, French writers? What was it about the Russians specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I taught this class, and I would alternate it with a class in the American short story, and that class was never as good somehow. And I don't exactly know why, except I think these Russian stories, they're kind of simpler. They're kind of have a they proceed on maybe a simpler moral ethical basis, and also it might just be that they're so old. Like when a contemporary reader reads these stories, her sort of you know temporary political or cultural ideas don't really come into play because it's all like samovars and sleds and no phones. And so I think there's a certain it might be a little bit like watching a Chaplin film. You're watching an old thing that's marked with its age, but then that gives you kind of permission to look at it very simply in terms of structure and form and that. So I have taught the American class, and I think I could probably selectively go through and find American stories that would work in a book like this. But weirdly, they'd all be the most Russian American stories. They'd be stories that were kind of simple, almost fables in their setup.
We were talking about you teaching and how you use these stories as a tool. I'm curious, your background, we've talked about this before, is in, a very different space, engineering and whatnot. But did you ever have the what you give to these students, did you have that version of an educator or a teacher at some point?
I had one very early. There's a wonderful teacher her name then was Sherry Williams, but she was married and is now Sherry Lindblom, and she was a teacher of mine in high school, and she had a kind of a American Lit class. I think it was maybe an honors class or something. So, but her attitude towards stories was so reverent and playful, and what she did that was so beautiful was she would make us, these little South Side of Chicago lunkheads, feel that we were totally qualified to enter the world of the stories as long as we did the work. And she had such enthusiasm for them and kind of affection for the writers even. She made it feel not like a class, but like a kind of a club. Like we were, these 16 and 17-year-olds were being invited into this club of people long dead who'd been intensely alive for a while and had looked around and reflected. And now, lucky us, we got to come into that club and sort of petition for membership. So she's also very incredibly personally charismatic. And so she sort of served as an advanced, charming person on behalf of Hawthorne and Melville and Hemingway and all that. So she was big just in making writing seem cool, making reading seem like something that a very cool person would, of course, do and be good at.
um, what I love about this book is how unexpected it was, at least for me, meaning I didn't think that this would be the next thing to come from you. And I was excited to see this kind of 180 in a little bit from Lincoln in the Bardo. I wonder if you think of it as, I was thinking about, for example, in the filmmaking world, you have someone like the Coen brothers, right? They make a huge successful film like No Country for Old Men, and it wins all the awards and it makes money and all these things. Then they go and make a film, which is my favorite film. There's A Serious Man, and it's like got no stars in it, and it's a very personal film, and it's about Hebrew school and all these different things. And it was kind of the idea of like one for them, one for us. Was this the moment after kind of the praise and acclaim that where you could do a book like this and you had kind of carte blanche to do anything you wanted?
Well, it was kind of like that, but it was also, I think, more truthfully, it was kind of coming out of a need that Lincoln book produced in me, which was to kind of go back to basics a little bit. Like when you tour a book like that, you're just talking all the time, and you're having opinions about things that you probably shouldn't. You don't, you haven't really thought about it, and so I felt when I went back to writing that I wanted to take a deep breath and kind of go into my version of solitude and say, okay, wait a minute, what am I doing here with the rest of my life? And sort of ask myself, are you willing to recommit to the purest form of literature? Kind of wean yourself off the attention part of it, which is very appealing to me. It's fun, but go back to the woodshed a little bit. And that was, I think, part of the motivation was to do that, and it really worked. To sort of get clear of the well, I mean, to read these great stories is to get clear of the idea that you know what you're talking about because they're so good. And the deeper I got into them, the more I'm like, oh, you're just scratching the surface of the story, no matter what the world is telling you. And so that was really good. I think it's sort of instead of a midlife crisis or a late to midlife crisis, I kind of did this instead. And yeah, yeah. But it was nice. I mean, when I went to Random House with the idea, Andy Ward was so nice about it. Like if he had, and I'm not, I don't always know what to do next. And so if I had gone to him and said, hey, great idea, I'm going to write, a really technical book about a bunch of old dead Russian guys, if he had said, I might have just not done it. But he was so into it, and he just could hear something in my voice that was, serious about it. So he was totally encouraging. So it was nice to get that support.
So the way the book is structured, of course, you invite the reader to read these stories, and then basically after the story, you kind of go into your space where you're the teacher. We're sitting in class with you at that point. That's stuff that usually would be done where we're sitting in a room and we're sharing a space, and you're actually talking that stuff out to the students. Was it difficult to translate what's usually verbal to the page like that?
You got it. That's exactly what the whole challenge was. That I thought, for a few months beforehand, I thought, oh, it'll be so cool. I'll just write up my notes, and then, but the notes that I had were really, there were arrows, pointing to certain parts of the story and kind of prompts like how to get a conversation going. And with our students, it doesn't take much. If you lead them to some fertile part of the story, they will go off to the races. So, you kind of lead the horse to the water, and the horse is very thirsty and will drink. So when you go to make the pivot to writing it, you have to make choices. And it was funny because one of my in the class, you can kind of fail to commit. You could just ask a question and let them answer it. In the essay, you sort of have to have an answer. So the model changes a little bit from it changes to let me put forth my most passionate idea about this story. Let me commit to something, and then the reader's job is sort of to push against it, maybe, or let it fall on her, see what she thinks about it. But it's certainly not the expectation that she'll agree, or that I'm right, or this is some authoritative reading, but rather the give and take that we get in the classroom is mimicked by me trying to be really forceful and persuasive, and then the reader kind of going, well, let me think about that. It was different. It was a different deal for sure.
I may have asked you this before, so forgive me if I have, but I was curious. I've been listening to lots of Neil Young lately, and he's been
Mm.
releasing all these kind of archive materials, and he's got like this endless supply of stuff that he's never released and stuff. I wonder, is there a George Saunders archive of stories that are just sitting out there that the world has never seen?
There is not. There definitely is not. Because I mean, there's some really bad early ones that I hope the world doesn't see. But no, really, I tend to either throw things away early, although that happens less and less often now, or I finish things. And it's kind of in the book a little bit. If you have at this point anyway, this wasn't true when I was young, but at this point, if I have a story that's failing, that I just understand the story to be saying to me, you have to take me more seriously because the way in which I want to succeed is not within your original idea of me. So I'm going to lock up and I'm going to sit here and be bad until you come to me with a larger vision of me. So that's kind of my working theory is that if something's not, the story's not good, it's because I'm conceiving it too narrowly. And then, unfortunately, you can't just snap your fingers and start conceiving of it correctly. I have to do it line by line until the kind of falseness in it starts to bother me, and that falseness is where the too small conception is living in a certain way. So, yeah, no, there's not much in the archives. There's
Um, I wonder, obviously, one of the great benefits of this book having these stories in there is that all these guys are dead. And so you didn't have to do, I would imagine they're all public domain stories and there was no major issue with the rights or anything like that. But was there any struggle in terms of getting the actual work in the book?
No, and again, that's Random House. I kind of said, "Can we do this?" And they said, "Well, let's look into it." And most of them are older. There were some fees involved, but not too much. So that was a real. We really jumped over a hurdle at that point because it could be that it could have been. It might have been the case it was too hard to do that, but it was really easy, and we got it no problem. So that was really great.
Have you ever, having done this class or having presented this work, or even since the book's come out, gotten any response from anyone in Russia about your takes on their writers?
I've gotten a lot of responses on people's takes. No Russian so far, but I'm sure that's coming. Some Russian scholars. But, in a way that, I mean, I'm pretty clever. And the book is a little bit crush proof in the sense that, that I say I don't read Russian. I never have. I kind of concede the fact that I don't know if these are good translations or not. I really don't know. And even if they are, they're not the originals. But the mission of the book is to say, let's pretend that we just found these things on a bus seat somewhere, written in exactly the English that they are. Are they pretty good? They're pretty good. Can we learn from them? We can. So what's interesting and what's really kind of lovely is I'm getting a lot of emails on my Syracuse account, which is a public open account, just people offering different readings of things, especially Alyosha the Pot for some reason, because I sort of leave that open at the end. And it's really kind of lovely, that people are taking me up on that challenge of, that we're trying to get in a tussle. We're trying to, my real goal wasn't to definitively nail down the stories, but to sort of spark a conversation and maybe just to say, to sort of model how fun it is to read stories and talk about them and how vital to a person's life that can be. So I'm getting all kinds of interesting mails about the stories and different readings, and it's actually exactly what I hoped for.
So many of the so many of the writers that you teach are they're advanced in the sense that they wouldn't get in your class if they weren't already great writers. So they're kind of at a certain level by the time they reach you. And so there's not, in the sense, at least what you talk about, you're not necessarily teaching them to write. You're kind of showing them certain pathways, and you dig into these stories. My question, I guess, is you seem to find value in taking apart a story, but I can't understand quite like why that is applicable. Like, why is it important for writers to tear apart a story? Like, they seem disconnected in a certain sense.
You're exactly right. And every year in the class, almost at the same time of year, somebody will ask that question. It's 100% valid. In other words, okay, we're taking these things apart. What does that teach me about how to put one together? And so I always say that the first answer has to be maybe nothing. It could be that these are totally unrelated activities. And I also say to the students in the class, if this is hurting you, which sometimes it can, sometimes people get too much up in their heads about it, or they try to be too analytical. I say just, they have to finish the class, but after that, just blow it off. Don't worry about it, But my experience of this has been that if you do this close reading, and then you sort of say, okay, I'm going to trust that this close reading is going to benefit my writing, but I don't have to say how, and I don't have to know how. I always say it's like there's a big silo over your head, and you're putting stories in there and your actual lived experience, and you're also putting these close readings and these analyses of the stories. Then you can just forget about it. And the idea is that having looked at a story that closely kind of raises your bar on what beauty is and how about how complexly organized the story can be. But you don't have to think about it. You just trust that kind of by osmosis, it kind of comes into your artistic body. Now, I don't know that that's true, really. It has been true for me, for sure. And the way it works for me is that towards the end of a story, I might just lightly apply some of these principles. Like, okay, I've got 6 sections. Every time I hit section 4, I don't know. What is section 4 causing? And is anything causing section 4? That kind of stuff, which is sort of by now built into my practice a little bit. But I think we in all this teaching stuff, we always have to say, I'm just offering it. You know, it might be that it has no value for you, dear student. So, but you have to. Your responsibility is to sort of fend me off. If you know, if I'm making a certain line, a certain argument, and you don't like it, your artistic integrity is for me to say, back off. You're not helping me. So we introduce that pretty early at Syracuse, even in the workshop format. Like I say to them, you have to tell me when it's helping, and you have to tell me when it's not helping, because I'm going to come at it sort of full speed ahead all the time until you tell me to stop. You know.
A couple more questions and we'll wrap up. And I'm curious, last time I spoke to you, we were talking about Lincoln and the Bardo, and you mentioned that you may never write another novel. That was kind of what you were doing at the time, and that you're a short story writer, and you don't see that kind of, at least at that moment, you didn't see that in the future. Do you still feel that way?
I feel hopeful that I will, but I also am being real skeptical about trying too hard, you know, because Lincoln, I didn't try that hard. It came at me for 20 years and insisted that I do it. And when I did, it was so fun. And, you know, so I'm just noticing myself trying a little hard to have an idea for a novel, which has never worked for me in the past. So for now, I'm just working on stories and kind of hoping that some idea will appear. What I do want to do is get into that same space with Lincoln where something in that book, the weird language, or actually the kind of straight language, you know, the kind of non-ironic stance of that book, really let me get into some fun places, morally, but also structurally. There was something about writing in that language that was a little more neutral than I usually would, that really opened up my palette a little bit. So I'm kind of hoping for that, but again, not trying too hard. Just, you know. We'll see.
Final question is this, beyond the 7 stories in the book, so we're talking Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Gogol. You mentioned in a class you would be reading upwards of maybe 40 stories. Once they read these 7, give us like the bonus track. What's a couple stories we should read beyond that?
Yeah, there's a really weird, there's 2 weird Dostoevsky stories that I didn't put in. One is called Bobak, and it's a bunch of dead people talking in a graveyard. It sounds familiar. And then the other one by him is called A Christmas Tree and a Wedding, which I almost put in as an example of a kind of, I wouldn't say a bad story, but a badly told story that still works, because it just doesn't hold together logically, but still it's got a punch to it. Then Chekhov, Lady with Pet Dog is maybe the best story ever written, which is kind of why I didn't put it in, because the main commentary would just be, wow.